Hello and welcome. I'm Glenn Fahey, Director of Education here at the Centre for Independent Studies. Artificial intelligence is rapidly transforming our lives and work, and our schools and universities are no exception. But are our education systems ready for the AI revolution? And will we ultimately be smarter as a result of it? Australia's educators and policymakers are concerned. As we speak, a parliamentary committee is preparing for hearings into the use of generative AI in the education system. That's in addition to emergency meetings of education ministers over recent months, the establishment of an AI task force, and many summits of teachers and leaders. Have we learnt the lessons to maximise the benefits to education while minimising the risks? There is promise that if properly harnessed, AI could help make education more efficient, effective and equitable. But done poorly, could AI result in mass plagiarism, replacing our teachers with robots and hollowing out the knowledge of students? To discuss the impact of all this and more, I'm joined by two leading experts, Daisy Christodoulou and Leslie Loble. Daisy is Director of Education at No More Marking, an online resource that helps teachers with writing assessment. She was previously Head of Assessment at ARC Schools and the author of 3 books, Teachers vs. Tech, Making Good Progress, and 7 Myths About Education. Leslie Loble is Industry Professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, and a Paul Ramsay Foundation Fellow. Her recent research includes the report Shaping AI and EdTech to Tackle Australia's Learning Divide. Daisy, Leslie, welcome to CIS. And Leslie, to kick us off, when we talk about AI in education, what specifically is it that we're talking about?
Well, there are a lot of tools, technological tools now that use AI that might be sitting in the background doing all sorts of things. But there were 3 that I particularly focused on when I was looking at it. Student-facing tools, primarily adaptive tutoring systems, the teacher-facing tools, which provide a range of curriculum support, formative assessment, feedback systems, and the like to make teachers' jobs easier and give them more information. And lastly, sort of big system-oriented tools that use AI-based techniques to crunch a lot of data, not just education data, and which are being used to help provide better support for early intervention for kids at risk.
And Daisy, you're of course engaged in the industry as well when it comes to AI. And what is it that you look at in particular?
So we would work mostly with what Leslie's categorised as the teacher-facing tools. So we develop tools that help teachers assess their students more effectively, assess their writing. And for a few years now, we've been using what I call probably some quite unglamorous AI processes just in our back office systems, which save people a lot of work, but probably are not going to sort of radically transform everything. They just make our processes more efficient. They save teachers time. And so I think the thing that I would add to what Leslie said is distinguishing between what I might call some quite boring but effective uses of AI, which tend not to capture the headlines, but are quite effective, and the new wave of large language models and generative AI, which since late last year have really captured people's imagination and sparked a lot of conversations, but I would almost maybe put in a different category to some of the other uses of AI that we see. So that would be an interesting thing to tease out, the difference between those large language models and some of the other uses of AI.
Well, to that point, Leslie, we've been talking about technology in education really for decades and decades, but is the application, particularly what Daisy's referring to there, is this a fundamentally new frontier when it comes to education applications?
Well, I'm going to say that's the proverbial yes and no. So yes, as Daisy said, generative AI has put us in a completely new dimension of, as the name implies, being able to generate responses, and it can give the sense of creativity. It's still based on basic AI principles of data in, coding to frame it, and a predictive capability of what the answer will be. But its speed, its scale, its scope, And the fact that it has gone beyond just a search engine into actually creating a response is different and has raised lots of questions for education. Just a quick on why I say there isn't a difference, and that's because the fundamental issues that are around AI and what role it should play in education are the same, whether it's what we now think is kind of old or boring, as Daisy said, or generative AI. We need to be very alert to the same issues around both.
So Daisy, the industry, as you mentioned, it's ChatGPT was really the galvanizing force in the public domain. But where is it in schools in particular, and of course in universities, where is generative AI currently sitting?
So that's a really interesting question. I spend a lot of time talking to heads and teachers about AI. I was at a conference in the UK a couple of months ago where there was a whole delegation of Australian teachers there hearing me speak. And I suppose if there's one thing that does worry me slightly, it's that a lot of the media narratives about large language models perhaps obscure a little bit of the reality. So the thing I'm always a little bit worried about is that whenever I will talk to a group of teachers or heads about LLMs in particular, they are really surprised when I give a few examples of the types of mistakes that they make. And one teacher, and it was actually an Australian teacher who was in England, came up to me afterwards and said, I had no idea they'd made mistakes like that. I'd heard people talking about mistakes, but I didn't realise. So I'd put up an example of a maths mistake, very, very basic maths error. And they said, I don't understand. I thought they'd get that right because that's just objective fact. They'd assumed that the things they got wrong were perhaps more contentious issues to do with misinformation, which is still not great. They were really surprised that it couldn't do what a pocket calculator could do. And I don't think that teacher was alone. I think there's lots of other teachers who are very surprised when I share that kind of information with them. So I think from that perspective, there's a lot of there's a lack of clarity really about what these tools are good and not good for. And the other thing that also slightly worries me is the extent to which, in terms of the pupil use of them for basically plagiarism or cheating, the extent to which people think that is fixable. So again, I hear a lot of people saying, well, it doesn't matter. I will know if my pupils are cheating. It'll be really obvious to me. Mm-hmm. And again, you look at the data, I'm not so clear that is the case. And similarly, people say, oh, well, you can find another AI tool that will detect AI written text. Mm. And again, actually, most of those tools are not very reliable. So I think there are some big issues about how teachers and students are engaging with these tools, about their reliability, their accuracy. And I think, yes, they are quite new and people perhaps aren't quite aware of exactly what their strengths and weaknesses are.
I think that's absolutely right. And the reason I say the same issues are kind of fundamental to no matter what type of AI is being used in education. I totally accept that generative AI has raised a heap of questions that we are only just starting to deal with. But the core elements of what make a difference to whether a tool will work or not remain the same. Is it well designed? And I will say generative AI ChatGPT is not designed at all for education. Now we have lots of what are called plugins coming in to try to, make it work better for education. But whether that design is pedagogically sound, whether it's got inclusive design of diversity of students, the quality dimensions are front and center in education to learning applications, full stop, including generative AI. The appropriate use is another very big area. And the over-reliance on these tools is a risk. And of course, governance is very significant. What data is in there? Where's that data going? Privacy, safety, all those issues. And what we see with ChatGPT is, and similar LLMs, is they are hoovering up just massive amounts of data. And we actually have much less insight to what's happening with that than we do with other sort of specific purpose education tools, even if they do have AI behind them.
Daisy, can I touch on an item you picked up before about the role of ChatGPT currently? Isn't it feasible that if we're smart enough to come up with AI tools that are smart enough to generate ChatGPT and generative AI generally, wouldn't we also be smart enough to come up with the tools to detect and address ChatGPT and other AI?
You would think that, but ultimately, I guess that's an empirical question. And all of the data out there at the moment suggests that those tools don't do a good enough job. So we did our own study. Looking at whether teachers could recognise it, and they couldn't. We then looked around at the different tools that are out there to detect AI, so the technical tools to detect AI, and most of them can't do it reliably. And I think even some people at ChatGPT have acknowledged that there isn't something that can give you the reliability. And I think teachers need to be really aware of that. And that's why I think the huge implications for schools and universities is if students are completing work in conditions where you're not clear whether they have used an LLM or not, to accuse a student of cheating is a big step. It's a high bar, and I've been a teacher, and it's, you've got to be really sure. And some of these tools for detecting will come back and they'll say 70% chance, 60% chance. And I just think as a teacher, like, what do you do with that information? There's a 60% chance this was copied from an LLM. Do you then say, right, okay, I'm gonna strike that out? The student could be completely innocent. So I just think these tools, they're not at the level of reliability that's enough for. I think they can end up poisoning a lot of the relationships between students and teachers. So at the state they're at the moment, they're not good enough. And even if they could get to the point where they did relatively reliably detect AI-generated text, it wouldn't take much for a student to tweak a couple of words to throw them again. So, AI has got to the point where it can produce work that can, get pretty good grades, but it's not got to the point where it can detect whether that work is generated by AI or not. And so it's created a problem, and it hasn't been able to solve that problem.
Leslie, what do you make of that? How do we address this risk with plagiarism? Do we need to tolerate a higher risk that material could be potentially plagiarised or partially plagiarised? Or is there a solution there in maybe involving repeat assessments or changing the environment that tasks are done? Where do you see that going?
Well, what you've described in the question to Daisy is basically a technological arms race. And I'm not sure that that's going to get us the tech itself trying to battle itself. So look, I mean, what you see is teachers already grappling with this. And, on the positive side of the ledger, writing and formal assessments or take-home tests or papers are only one form of assessment. And so as I travel around talking to teachers, it's incredible how they're starting to rethink how they might assess it. There's also a lot of educators out there who are saying, let's flip the equation. Let's actually explicitly acknowledge that we've got ChatGPT or other LLMs. Let's bring that in. And let's instead assess students on how much they've improved it, added their analysis, their personal voice, and so forth. It's nonetheless, as Daisy suggests, it's quite tough. And it does mean that presumably this will lead to more and more changes in how we look at assessment. And at some point, I suppose, we may look back on this in 5 years and say, why did we think it was such a problem? Because we may have figured out a way through it, as we did with other technological aspects that came into education that seemed to be impossibly disruptive, whether it was a calculator and kids not knowing how to do maths, or the internet undermining knowledge acquisition. So the only other thing I would really emphasize is that the good news here is that what really works in terms of discouraging cheating are actually the fundamental things that make great education. So the more that students see that teachers actually have high expectations for them, care about their learning, and that assessment is part of that, then it has a positive effect on reducing cheating, but also a positive effect on engagement and learning.
So, Daisy, what do you make of the argument that Leslie's just highlighted there to an extent? The question about the moral panic, if you like, about potential ChatGPT and other applications. That haven't we heard this all before about the risks about students don't need to calculate because they've got calculators. They don't need to know things because they've got Google. Is ChatGPT just the latest generation of that same argument?
So, no, and I mean, look, if the pocket calculator internet analogies are good ones, but let's look at how we responded to those, or at least what I think the more successful responses were. And in the case of the pocket calculator, you have non-calculator assessments. So people accepted that you do need to learn how to calculate without a calculator, that it doesn't eliminate the need to know your basic math facts. And the same with the internet. That, again, it's important that there are a lot of assessments that students do without access to the internet, because it is important for them, again, to know basic facts, because knowing those basic facts is not something that can be outsourced. So I think I see a kind of debate going on at the moment. I think everyone acknowledges, actually, we are going to have to make some reforms to our exam system and to our assessment system in order to, meet this challenge. And the debate I see is, on the one hand, the side I place myself on is to essentially say we should respond the way we responded with the pocket calculator and say we need non-calculator papers. We need, particularly with younger students, so we need assessments where we know for sure that that assessment was not completed by ChatGPT. And then on the other side, you have people saying, actually, no, it's fine. We can just, let students use ChatGPT and actually just see how they engage with it. That's actually part of the task, and that's part of that's what they'll be doing in their jobs. So we should let that happen. And I think I disagree with that. I disagree with that approach. And so I disagree for a couple of reasons. First, I think it misunderstands what assessment is, and I think this is one of the most poorly understood but most fundamental principles of assessment, which is that an assessment is not actually about the quality of the end product. People think it is, and it isn't. Assessment is about the inferences you can make from that student's end product. So one of the weird things about assessment is that people who are big fans of exams and really like assessments will tell you that exam scores don't actually matter. An exam score in and of itself does not matter. The piece of work a student produces in an exam, actually that doesn't matter. What matters are the inferences that you can make from that exam or that test score. And all forms of cheating compromise those inferences. And ChatGPT has the potential to compromise those inferences. So I do think it is going to change the way we think about assessment. But I think, the way I'd like to see it change is to see more kind of terminal sort of closed book exams.
Where do you sit on that one, Leslie? Do we go down the road of having special tests that are environment friendly for ChatGPT and other tools? Or do we assess how well students integrate and use the range of technology available to them?
Well, as I said in the previous answer, I think that it is important to keep in mind that the written, kind of standard written assessment that ChatGPT is particularly affecting is one of a suite. And we will have to think differently about how we assess student knowledge. And so I certainly, think that it will push us in that direction. We also know in Australia that some of our most important exams that we take quite seriously, like our end of schooling exams, actually are in very controlled circumstances. And I wouldn't think we'd want to move away from that. So it doesn't mean that we have to design some radically new way to test, it does mean that preferencing of knowledge and skill applied in a circumstance that is not necessarily known to the student before they walk through the door, to demonstrate their knowledge and skill, and hopefully their analysis, their capability, and the like, is going to be quite important. But it's not necessarily, we can't just do the same thing we've always done, which is write us an essay, go home, write us an essay, hand in a report, those sorts of things. We're going to have to look differently.
And Daisy, Rebecca asked, do you think schools should be on the front foot in terms of developing their own policies? That is, do we need more innovation in the responses within the sector?
So yeah, that ties in a bit to what Leslie was just saying. So I would say here in the UK, as well as in Australia, in schools, a lot of terminal exams are closed book exams where there's no potential for cheating. And actually, those we probably don't have to change. As Leslie said, there's no real need to be moving away from those. And I actually think the other thing about those is there's a bit of a jargon phrase in assessment, negative washback, which is all the bad impacts that can come from exams. But now and again, you get a rare and happy example of positive washback, which is where you get some good things that come from the existence of exams. And I actually think this is one of them. That certainly in state schools in England, where most exams are, as I say, these terminal handwritten exams, because of that, because everyone knows they're working towards that, it does mean that they are more likely to be setting, or at least to be aware that in the end, because they're going to be assessed using this task, they are practicing handwritten assessments, and I think in closed conditions. So I think there is a bit of a value to that. I think where the issue is going to come is, again, where Leslie said, what about those homework tasks that you would typically set, where you'd say, go off and write a report? Or even, Leslie saying it's just writing. Actually ChatGPT can answer, can give answers to lots of other kinds of questions as well. So I think the big issue, certainly for the schools I've talked to in England, is around homework. That typical model of go home, do this, come back the next day. I think that's the crucial issue. So I think Rebecca's question, do we need to be on the front foot? I think, yes, we do need to be monitoring that and thinking about that. I think we also need to be aware of how much is ChatGPT out there in the wild. I was talking to a group of students recently who had never heard of it. And you think, they've never heard of it. Actually, maybe it isn't as common as you think. But then they had all been using Snapchat to do their French homework. And then you found out, which I didn't know, that Snapchat has an LLM integrated within it. So you can ask it your French homework and it will do it for you. So I do think schools are going to have to get on the front foot. I think homework for me would be the particular issue. I have spoken to quite a few heads here who are playing around with different ideas for that. I think a few of them want to see just how big an issue it is. You have some who are saying, well, let's just get rid of those traditional styles of homework. I've seen others who are saying maybe we need to do something a bit more like a prep session after school. And actually that could have other types of benefits, that at least the students, they have an hour after school in a controlled condition to do their work. And actually that might be quite nice for home life, because then they can go home and their homework's done. So I've seen a few different responses to it. I don't think it's straightforward, but I think it is something that schools absolutely need to be thinking about. And I actually think the issue is probably slightly easier for schools and universities. Again, because most school assessment is done terminally. Whereas university assessment, we're the best in the world, of course, there have to be tasks where you go off and you write a dissertation or a 5,000 or 10,000 word essay, and that can't be done in controlled conditions. And I think handling that is going to be a huge issue for universities, and they do need to get on the front foot and think about that. I think when you talk to a lot of people in universities in private, they will say for a few years now, something that there's a bit of growing concern behind the scenes that they'd maybe rather not talk about, is the rise of paid plagiarism, pre-LLMs, which is wealthy students paying people essay mills to write their essays for them. Now, you could just about manage that. It's not great, but you could just about manage that when it's only 5% of wealthy students. If you're in a world where effectively that ability to produce on-demand essays is democratized, you do have a huge threat to the validity. And I'm not going to pretend I have the answers there. I don't think that is an easy question, but I do think it is a question that university administrators need to be seriously grappling with, because it has the threat to really undermine the value of a lot of degrees.
Leslie, in an unconventional way, Daisy's brought up the angle about where technology and equity sit. And a big theme in your research has been the potential for AI and ed tech to help bridge digital divides and learning divides. Where are you sitting on that? Have you found that there's opportunities to reduce inequities, or is it an exacerbator of inequities?
Well, if we don't make the right decisions, it will make inequity even worse. But let me start with the positive. I mentioned up front that, for example, adaptive intelligent tutoring systems, for example, are we see them now in the generative AI space, where there's kind of the tutor on the side, which is not feeding an answer, but asking questions and helping students move further. So these have tremendous potential, right? And there's actually been statistically significant impact, and especially for students who are struggling. There have been randomized control trials and the like. It's probably one of the strongest areas that's been researched. And it works because it follows the basic core things we know work in education: explicit instruction, a highly and appropriately structured scope and sequence, and a mastery pathway, an adaptation that allows you to branch and give students extra instruction and bring them back onto the pathway. So in fact, it offers a lot of benefits, because it doesn't care whether you're poor or rich, whether you're a migrant or not, whether English is your first language or not. It's designed to help all students reach a level of mastery and do that in a more differentiated way. So that can be quite positive. Another example is I was involved in something at UTS for university educators focusing on AI and disability. And I'll tell you, that comes through. There were a couple of students and an educator who have disabilities of different sorts, and it came through really powerfully how these learning apps, including generative AI apps, have profoundly changed their lives. And so you are now able to get much richer description, for example, of translating text into voice or images into voice. The question was posed on that webinar: is ChatGPT an adaptive tool that should basically be seen in that context? And it was overwhelming people saying yes. So it can have very positive impacts, but the grave risk, and I'm sorry to be going so long, I'll end in a moment here. The grave risk is, as Daisy just said, when ChatGPT costs $240 a year for a single subscription, we know who will be affording that and which households have already signed up to it and have their accounts and are already using it. We know that the skill to use these technologies increases the more confidence and ability you have. So prompts are a very big part of whether you will have an effective engagement with them or not. And it's a bit of it's just a back of an envelope calculation. But if you take $240 a year and without, progressive pricing schemes, a school of 1,000 kids, that's the equivalent in Australia of 3 new teachers, and just for one app. So this could exacerbate our learning divide unless we make the conscious decisions to make sure we're investing and making sure that teachers are confident and able to use the tools.
Daisy, what do you see in the UK and elsewhere? Are teachers and schools currently well equipped to make the most of the benefits that Leslie's talking to here?
So I think what Leslie said about the adaptive AI is really true. And I would sort of class that in what I was saying as my sort of pre-LLM technologies. And there have been some really interesting experiments with those. There have been some that maybe are not using enormous amounts of AI, but where there's potential to do it. The one I always talk about is MindSpark, which is being used in India and parts of the developing world to help teach children who otherwise, they wouldn't have a teacher. And the adaptivity Leslie talks about is really powerful, because what that adaptivity is trying to do is to almost replicate what a good teacher would do. So that if a student gets something wrong or they get it partially right, that it will then give them the next question or the next learning resource based on exactly what they've got wrong. And that if you've got a bunch of data of students who have made exactly that same mistake, you can then really tailor what they're given next. So that part of AI, I think, is really powerful. And I think there are interesting things being done there, and that ability to spot patterns in large sets of data, which humans, even a teacher who's been teaching, they've taught thousands of children over, decades, they won't have that. It's still, even then, they won't have that same, amount of data to call on. So I think that all that is really powerful. But I would just hesitate to, almost mix that up with LLMs. I'm not sure LLMs are doing that very effectively. As I say, I think, some other narrower types of AI are doing that more effectively. And I think something Leslie said earlier is really important on this, where she said that ChatGPT is not designed for education. And that's right, it isn't. It's designed as a general text tool. And the problem with that then becomes, well, it's not optimized for these precise adaptive issues that Leslie and I have been talking about. It's not optimized to do those. And one of the things, I haven't talked a lot about the research we've done with LLMs, but we've been trying to get them to assess students' writing. And one of the things we found is they're not very good. They're not as good as humans. They're not as good as we'd hoped. Everyone keeps saying to us, well, wait for the next release. The next release, it'll be better. And we found from 3.5 to 4, actually, it got slightly worse. So this is the other thing, because they're not optimized for what you're trying to do. There's no guarantee that future releases might make them better in area A, B, and C, but might make them worse in the area you're interested in, because they're not being specifically designed for one purpose. So I would say on the LLM issue, I have become a bit more of a skeptic on them for a variety of these reasons. And I realise that goes against the grain, and there's lots of people out there talking about how they're going to, upend the world. But I would probably, and No More Marking certainly where we've ended up, is we would probably like to be, spending a bit more time with some of these less glamorous, narrower models that at least do what they say, than LLMs, which are quite unstable, have a lot of inaccuracies, a lot of hallucinations, and are not optimized for what you're trying to achieve. So that would be where we've come down on after a lot of months of trial and error.
Leslie,
and you can monitor them better. That's the other difference from a governance perspective.
Yeah, it's very true.
Yeah, no, Leslie, I was going to come to you there on some of the, I guess, less glamorous versions and applications. We've spoken a bit about those that are student-facing and teacher-facing to an extent, but what about some of the back-end stuff? Surely there's great opportunity to make the complex operations of schools and even universities work more efficiently through AI. Do we know enough about efficient use yet?
Well, I mean, in a sense, schools and certainly school systems are just like, there are corporate applications out there in a sense that can help with that. We have learning management systems, which have been around for quite a while and, are very important and effective. I think the particular focus, I think the key leverage point really is teachers. It always is. And what we need to be looking at and thinking about, let me also just say, it has been quite striking how quickly and how many teachers have picked up ChatGPT, even if it's the free version, and are using it in so many different ways, right? And there are blogs and conversations all over the internet about it. I will say this for generative AI is that it feels as a user that you are much more in control than some of these other tools that use a narrower AI. And I think that's an important lesson. I assume most of those tools out there, by the way, are scrambling right now to figure out how to get generative AI into their tool. And I think that could be a good thing. If it's a bounded, understood, and quality, underpinnings to a tool that has the added advantage of generative AI, I think that could be quite positive, as opposed to just going into this kind of unknown large language models, which aren't necessarily, as Daisy was just saying, designed for the specific purpose.
Daisy, how well informed is the market at the moment, if you like, but be it educators, system leaders, policymakers even? Are we still in the dark a little bit?
I think we all are. Because it's very new. And I think the other thing you're saying, in the dark, again, the very difficult thing about a lot of these, and actually this isn't just LLM, but kind of all deep learning, is it is almost everyone's in the dark. The people who create it are in the dark. That's actually one of the big issues about deep learning AI techniques, is that the creators of the tools themselves don't know how these tools arrive at their answers. And I think everyone acknowledges that's a big problem. So I think there's a fundamental level of darkness, if you like, that everyone is in. I would then say there are also these issues around, certainly a lot of the teachers I'm speaking to thinking that if they do make mistakes, it's only on kind of contentious issues where there's real disagreements, that the people are not aware they make very basic errors on things like maths. To go back to the point though, just, we were saying about, these more specific back office uses and what have you. I'll just give you a quick example of how we use AI very effectively in a slightly boring but, efficient way. We assess students' writing. We get teachers to upload their children's writing on paper. They scan it in and then they upload it to our website. And every now and again, a teacher will accidentally upload a blank sheet of paper. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you're assessing 100,000 students, as we might do, and you've got 200,000 pieces of paper, if even just 1 or 2% are blank sheets of paper, that's a big problem, because those blank sheets of paper, when the teachers are then comparing them, if there's a blank sheet, what do they do? So it's really important for us to get rid of the blank sheets of paper. And we can ask teachers to do that, and that's quite time consuming and annoying for them and a bit of a trivial task. We can do it ourselves, and it takes us a really long time. We built an AI tool that would recognise blank sheets of paper, and it does it brilliantly. And it does it with like a 99.9% accuracy rate, and it barely has any false positives. It doesn't pick actual pieces of writing and say they're blank. And it's great, and it saved everybody time. So things like that are fantastic. And, if you can imagine, if there's 5 or 6 or 10 different things like that going on that are all saving teachers a bit of time, that's really powerful. But that, as I say, is quite different from LLMs, where they're not giving you kind of 99.9% accuracy on things, where they're quite unstable, where they'll give you a different result one day to the next, where you're not quite sure how they're arriving at their answers. So that's where I'd kind of I would really distinguish between, models where you have a bit more of an idea of what's going on, and LLMs where I think all of us are quite a bit in the dark with them.
Daisy, do you think opening up that transparency box then is the answer? That is, if we can see how this information is generated, understand it, and maybe even get confidence ratings, would that help to relieve some of the concern?
So I think there are certainly things that OpenAI, is ironic given their name, could be doing to be more open and transparent. So I gave evidence to a parliamentary select committee in the UK a few months ago. And they said, what's the one thing you would change about AI governance? And I said it would be great to see these LLMs release their training sets. So what data have they been trained on? And be a bit more open and transparent about that. So I would like to see that, and there's certainly a case for that. What I would say, though, as I said before, is that there is an aspect of all of these models that is fundamentally opaque. That even if you released absolutely everything about them, and even if you've got real technical experts, they're still not quite sure why an LLM will spit out one thing one day and another thing the next. It's almost a feature, not a bug. And that, I would say, from an engineering and a systems point of view, is one of the things that people find most difficult about these. And it's one of the things where I was listening to an interview recently with, I think, the California head of road safety, that if you're trying to design a system, having a part in the system which has a 70% chance of doing one thing and a 30% chance of doing another. Systems engineers in these kind of critical environments are not used to dealing with that level, the sort of probabilistic parts. They're used to dealing with much more deterministic parts. And I think that's going to be an issue for all of us. That how do you get a consistency at scale when you're dealing with these probabilistic systems?
Leslie, we've touched on governance slightly and not quite delved into it. You've advised policymakers to think about governance risks. What are the sorts of things that you think are most important at this stage?
Well, I'd say I think the transparency, and then some people say explainability, is important, as Daisy said, but it's going to be people like Daisy who will be able to pick it apart and tell us whether something's working or not. I think what we need as well is a clear set of standards that start from what educators want to see in this technology. It's easy to get seduced by it. I mean, it's incredible, and every day there's both, fantastical examples, both good and bad. And, I think there's an industry out there on YouTube of people who have put prompts in to get the most outrageous response out of an LLM. But if we start from the point of what we want to see in education technology, and we start from the point of education, I think that's crucial, and build a set of standards that may get translated into technical specifications. And I'm not saying that we ignore the coding, but it starts with what do we expect to see in terms of quality evidence behind the tool, its capabilities, its capacity for inclusion, equity, fairness, ethics, and so forth. And importantly, that we, and that can be done. We tend to get very overwhelmed by the complexity of the black box. But if we start from something that we actually do know and design technology to serve those purposes, that's something that we could start with real confidence. The other thing that's really important is to view that across a life cycle of the technology. So at the moment, the way schools and systems purchase an application is it's all upfront, and it's through a procurement process that preferences things like value for money. And maybe we need to shift those criteria. But we then take our eye off the ball. And the thing about AI is that it's changing. It's changing over time. And so we need to embed those standards and expectations, and then have an oversight process, an auditing process, and the like, that looks across the life cycle for impact, both good and bad, and has the capacity to correct if needed.
Daisy, do you see any positive steps that from the UK's governance approaches here that educators and policymakers in Australia should be looking to?
I think the UK have been quite proactive, and I think it's been a priority for central government. So there's been some interesting things being done there. I think there's a big summit coming up shortly. So I think in that sense of being proactive and engaging with it. I think what I'd say is it's good to be proactive and engaging. I'd say this is true for government and for schools. It's good to be proactive and take the first step and engage with it, but you also don't want that to shade into perhaps being kind of overly optimistic about how it might play out. And as you probably got the impression from everything I've been saying, with the LLMs in particular, we have really been on a roller coaster ride with them. And when I first met Leslie and you, Glenn, I was in Australia back in February, March, and my colleagues were kind of back home working full time, trying to work out and running these research projects, which you can read all of them on our blog. And we initially started out thinking it had enormous potential. We have become, more skeptical, just because empirically the data we're getting is not good enough. So I am all for, we've been very proactive. We've absolutely been out there trying to engage with it and work out what it can and can't do. But it's also, my worry is there are a lot of big organizations who will have invested a lot of financial and kind of social capital into these projects and then won't be able to admit they're not working. Okay, so I feel like we need to engage with it, but we need some honesty, all of us, about what they can and can't do, because the history of AI is also a history of big AI winters and disillusionment. It's like all technology has hype cycles, but AI has really dramatic hype cycles, right? Where things just stop working and programs get shut down and everyone gets very annoyed with, the time and money that's been wasted on things. So I do think we have to engage with it. And as I say, we have very much engaged with it, more than a lot of organisations in education, but we need to retain our kind of critical faculties of it as well.
It almost sounds like LLMs are like the crypto of the finance sector almost.
Every time I look on Twitter, people who a year ago on Twitter had like crypto in their bio, now they have AI and LLM, and that worries me. That really worries me. Yeah.
Well,
I don't
Daisy's
have AI or LLM in my bio.
Daisy's raised another piece that, when you think in terms of public policy, that we need to add into the equation. And as boring as it sounds, it's research. So research into what works and research into whether these things work. And it's not only AI that's subject to a lot of hype. We've seen come through schooling over and over again, lots of claims about, we had the interactive whiteboard moment where that was going to change everything. So skepticism is important, and we need to not only take kind of a strict governance point of view, but build into that governance the fact that we're going to look at research about them and impact. And I would also say what's not particularly well covered at the moment in research is usage of the tools. And I suspect we'd agree on this webinar that if it's set and forget, let's send the student off to go work with this and come back, tell me how you've gone at the end of the lesson, or come back from when you've used it. That's not going to work. It absolutely has to be embedded in teacher-led practice. And I don't think that's well understood yet. And we know that a minority of teachers in various surveys, both in Australia and internationally, say they already don't feel that confident using technological tools in their practice. And so we have a lot to do.
Daisy, on that, I'm just going to merge a couple of questions that have just come through in the last few minutes. Is there a degree to which we've got to help embed criticality within school teams to be really self-critical about the usages and I suppose risks to that point around AI? Is a healthy skepticism at the school level beneficial?
I do think, as I say, this is something that is not going away and is there, and we can't stick our heads in the sand. And, as I say, we do need to understand how students are using it, what it can and can't be used for, and what impact that's going to have. So I think to that extent, school leaders do have to be engaged with it, even just things like, it's in Snapchat now, right? Like knowing that. So we do have to engage with it. As I've said, what I'm wary of is if schools put a lot of time and effort into perhaps trying to get it to do things that perhaps it might not be able to do. And where I worry about that is schools with the best will in the world don't have the technical expertise for that. And they could waste a lot of time. Look, I'll be honest, we have technical expertise at our company. And, there's a part of us that feels we've wasted time because it's just not doing what we wanted it to do. So, we can handle that, but a school, I worry that might happen. And I worry too, again, talking about maybe some of the crypto AI types you see on the internet, who it's all about, you've just got to get the prompt right. I see a lot of this. You've got to you're just not asking it the right questions. You know, if you ask it the right way, and I feel like you've got a breed of people on Twitter, what I call ChatGPT whisperers, you know, that they've got this secret sauce that they ask it the right question, then it always gives them the right answer. It is far, far more complex than that. You know, it is not about you put the right form of words in and, you know, open sesame, everything works perfectly. And I worry, I see a few teachers kind of going down that route. So I just want to be aware too, there are things we are going to have to commit to thinking about with this, but I don't want this to become another fad, another thing that teachers put a lot of time into. Actually, it doesn't work out. And I think, to go back to that point Leslie was making, in some ways, the slightly frustrating thing about all of this is that we do know the fundamentals of what makes good teaching. And there is a risk that some of this AI stuff is a distraction from that, not a help. And we've kind of arrived at that point with assessment too, is that we have not seen anything from anything that AI can do that it's better than what we would say is the gold standard of assessment, which we would say is human comparative judgment. And if something comes along that's better than that, we'd love to embrace it, but we haven't seen anything yet. So I think we always have to be looking at kind of what is the current gold standard, and can AI do better than that, and not forgetting about those fundamental principles.
We are just about out of time, but I'd like to throw to both of our experts to I suppose ask the impossible question with the gift of foresight. I'll go Leslie first, and then Daisy. Are we optimistic or pessimistic at the end of all this about the role for AI?
Well, as I might have said before we got started, that is the worst and hardest question you could have asked. I think we have to be optimistic. Let's just put it that way. We have to be optimistic. We have to be realistic. As Daisy's been saying, there's a healthy degree of skepticism. We certainly see, even stepping outside of education, very important debates happening internationally and in Australia about what role AI should have and how do we ensure that it's serving our needs, and some very, very significant challenges. But if we don't remain positive about the direction, if we don't try to shape its direction, if we do this in health, by the way, right? So it's always interesting to me to see the differences. In health, we accept, both for normative and other reasons, we accept that we absolutely can set the criteria for what we expect to see in terms of treatments, and some of those are technological or diagnosis. And then we set up a regulatory system, and it's long-standing, that says we're going to back that in with a process that then can give us more confidence about whether these tools have been tested, and we can be optimistic about their use. I would say we have to do the same thing in education. Let's find and focus on the positive uses, and then let's set the standards, the investments, the supports, the research to make sure that they actually can be driven home and implemented. Not easy, but something we have to do, and we have to remain optimistic.
And Daisy, to close us out there, optimist or pessimist?
So I think about this a lot, and I change my mind a lot. I've come to the conclusion that one of the biggest things stopping me being optimistic now is everybody else's optimism. What I mean by that is, whenever I explain to people the kind of disappointing results we've been getting, the number one response I get, and it's like a hive mind, like people from all different backgrounds, all different walks of life, they'll say, but it's only going to get better. And I probably would have said that myself a year ago. You know, there's this saying in technology, the phone you've got in your hand right now is the worst phone you'll ever own. You know, technology is only going to go one way. But actually, first of all, is that true? Like, there are actually a lot of examples of technologies that do fizzle out and die and don't develop into what their inventors hoped for. And what also worries me is just this, there's an assumption, as I say, that, well, if we just keep doing what we're doing, it will keep getting better. But actually, there are a lot of prominent thinkers about AI who are saying, who would disagree with that. And I'm not necessarily coming down one side or the other. I'm just saying that within AI, there is a debate. And the people on the other side of the debate are the people who are saying, the models you've got at the minute, it's like growing trees to get to the moon. You'll show progress for quite a while, and then it will top out. And you need something different. So, I'm kind of torn on this. Yeah, as I say, I think the point Leslie made. We do need research, and we need to be looking at the data. And the thing I keep coming back to is, when the facts change, I'll change my mind. Right. So there's lots of things here I've said where I've been fairly skeptical. I was in Australia 6 months ago and probably been a bit more positive. Perhaps in 6 months we'll be more positive again. But you have to kind of go where the facts lead you.
Well, that's all we have time for. We will date stamp that current position of yours, Daisy, and remind you in 6 months' time of where we're sitting then. Thank you, Daisy. Thank you, Leslie, for your insights today. I'm sure we've learned, all of our viewers have learned a lot.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
It's been great.
Thanks. Yeah, really good to chat.
Now, for decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice, working tirelessly to deliver evidence-based public policy, especially in the critical area of education. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. CIS relies solely on the generosity of people like you to help us advance our cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.